In an age where every journey leaves a receipt, every phone call leaves a record, and almost every street corner has a pair of eyes watching from above, it seems impossible for a person to vanish without a name. And yet, now and then, a case appears that makes that belief feel dangerously naive. Because sometimes, a body is found in a place so strange, so hidden, and under circumstances so disturbing that even before investigators begin asking who the victim was, another question takes hold. How did he get there in the first place? This is the story of the burned body discovered inside Shaft 4 of the old Arawa textile mill in Kano, and the mystery of why, for years afterward, nobody ever came forward to claim him. It was just after 4:40 in the morning when Chinedu Afolayan heard the alarm. The sound was not especially loud, but in the near-empty control room, it stood out immediately. A sharp, repetitive warning tone coming from the heat monitoring console that oversaw the mill's older exhaust systems. Chinedu had worked nights for almost 9 years, and by that point, there were few things inside the sprawling factory complex that could still surprise him. The worst part of the shift was always the final hour, when exhaustion settled heavily into the bones and even small tasks felt larger than they were. Shaft 4. Overheat fault. That alone was unusual. Shaft 4 belonged to the abandoned die processing wing, an older part of the mill that had not been fully decommissioned, but which was rarely used except during maintenance purges or emergency venting. Most of the younger workers barely knew the place existed. It stood at the far edge of the property, past the main weaving hall, beyond the chemical stores, and near a line of broken windows that overlooked a weed-choked loading yard. Chinedu considered logging the fault and leaving it for the day team, but the night had been quiet, and curiosity got the better of him. After informing his supervisor, Musa Danjuma, that he was going to inspect the old shaft, Chinedu left the control room and started across the factory. At that hour, the mill felt less like a workplace and more like a sleeping machine. The weaving rooms were still. Conveyor belts hung silent. Half-lit corridors stretched into darkness, broken only by the occasional hum of old fluorescent tubes. Here and there he passed other workers, a security guard sipping tea, 2 cleaners speaking in hushed voices, an electrician coming off break, each of them offering the tired, automatic greetings of people waiting for sunrise. When Chinedu reached the abandoned die wing, the air changed. Even after all those years, the place still carried a bitter scent of old chemicals, wet concrete, and scorched dust. The roof above had partially collapsed in one section, and rusted pipes ran like veins along the walls. Shaft 4 rose from the floor near the back of the hall, a tall, rectangular vent column of blackened metal, bolted against a support frame and disappearing through the ceiling. At ground level, there was a narrow maintenance access door. Chinedu tried the handle first. It did not move. He crouched and shone his flashlight across the hinges. They were thick with corrosion, layered in reddish-brown rust. Whatever had triggered the overheat warning, it clearly had not come from someone entering through the bottom. That left only the upper hatch. He stood, slung the flashlight under his arm, and climbed the iron ladder fixed to the side of the shaft. The metal rungs were cold and slightly damp. By the time he reached the inspection platform near the top, his breathing had deepened and sweat had begun to gather at the base of his neck. He directed the beam of the torch toward the hatch wheel, braced himself, and forced it open. A wave of hot, stale air rolled out. Chinedu recoiled, turned his face away, and waited for the heat to pass. Then, cautiously, He leaned forward and aimed his flashlight into the darkness below. At first, he did not understand what he was seeing. The inside of the shaft was a cage of narrow metal braces, soot, and vent channels descending into shadow. Then the light settled on something pale and unnatural, wedged against a crossbeam halfway down. What he thought was torn cloth was not cloth. What he thought was scrap timber was an arm. And then the face came into view, or what remained of it. The head was tilted at an impossible angle. The skin had been burned dark and tight in some places, stripped away in others. The empty mouth seemed fixed in a final, soundless cry. Chinedu stumbled backward so suddenly he nearly slipped from the platform. Later, he would tell police that his mind refused to accept the sight at first. It was too wrong, too out of place. A human body inside an industrial exhaust shaft. Not lying peacefully, not hidden neatly, but jammed into the metalwork as though it had fallen there alive and had never found a way out. Within minutes, the alarm had spread beyond the die wing. Security sealed the area. The police were called. Workers finishing the night shift were ordered away from the building, though many lingered at a distance, trading rumors in frightened voices. By sunrise, officers from Kano State Criminal Investigation Department had arrived, along with a pathologist and a fire scene examiner. Leading the investigation was Inspector Amina Yusuf, a methodical officer known for staying quiet until she had enough facts to speak with certainty. When she reached Shaft 4, the first thing she noticed was the heat still trapped inside the metal housing. Though the purge system had been shut off, the internal temperature remained far above normal. Technicians explained that residual heat sometimes lingered in those old ducts for hours after activation, especially when blockages restricted airflow. Amina climbed the platform herself. From above, she could see the body clearly. It appeared to belong to a man, likely adult, lean, and not especially tall. He was caught against a slanted maintenance brace nearly 12 feet below the top hatch. Both legs were twisted beneath him. One arm was extended upward, the fingers curled and blackened. Strips of cloth had been wound around the palms and one forearm, as if he had tried to protect himself from the burning metal while climbing. That detail disturbed her more than anything else, because it suggested movement. It suggested struggle. It suggested that whoever this man was, he had not entered the shaft already dead. Removing the body proved difficult. The lower maintenance door was eventually forced open using cutting tools, but only after nearly 2 hours of labor. By then, a small crowd had formed outside the mill gates. Workers, local journalists, nearby traders, and curious residents drawn by the sight of police vehicles. Once the remains were brought out, the condition of the victim only deepened the mystery. He wore fragments of ordinary clothing, the remains of dark jeans, a light cotton shirt, and a denim jacket with cheap brass buttons. No helmet, no factory overalls, no boots. On his feet were scorched trainers, the soles partly melted. He had no wallet, no identification card, no watch, no keys. Nothing in his pockets except a half-burned intercity bus ticket, so damaged that only a few letters and the edge of a printed number survived. The post-mortem raised still more questions. The victim was estimated to be between 25 and 35 years old. There was evidence of prior dental treatment, including a crown and at least 2 fillings, suggesting he had once had access to decent care. Several fractures were present in both legs, along with severe injury to the right shoulder and ribs. The pathologist believed these injuries likely occurred before death, possibly during a fall inside the shaft. Soot inside the airway indicated he had still been breathing after the fall. That meant he had burned alive. For the investigators, the immediate problem was access. How had he entered? The ground-level door, as already noted, had been badly rusted and almost certainly unused for years. The top hatch, meanwhile, could only be reached by climbing the exterior ladder from inside the mill, or by crossing an elevated service walkway accessible through a locked maintenance corridor. In other words, this was not a place a random passerby could easily wander into. The mill itself was fenced. Though not impossible to breach, it was patrolled at night by private security. The older employees all knew one another, and strangers in the active sections of the plant would usually draw attention quickly. If the victim had entered from outside, he had done so with remarkable precision. If he had entered from inside, then someone working there might have seen him. And yet, when detectives interviewed the entire night shift, no one admitted to seeing any unfamiliar man inside the facility. No one reported hearing screams. No one reported an accident. No one claimed to know the victim. That silence would become one of the strangest aspects of the entire case. Over the next several weeks, police pursued every ordinary explanation first. Missing persons reports from Kano and neighboring states were reviewed. Hospitals were contacted. Dental records were compared wherever possible. Transit companies were asked about ticket stock that matched the burned bus stub. A sketch artist created a facial approximation based on the skull structure and surviving features, though heat damage made that task imperfect at best. Newspapers published the reconstruction. Local radio stations discussed the case. Still, nothing. No family called. No friend came forward. No employer reported a worker who had vanished. The man inside Shaft 4 seemed to have no name at all. As investigators widened the scope of their inquiry, attention turned to the nature of the mill itself. The Arawa textile complex had seen better decades. Once a major employer, by the late 1990s it had fallen into partial decline. Sections were underused. Maintenance standards had slipped. Former workers spoke of labor disputes, unpaid wages, theft, and occasional sabotage. Trucks came and went at odd hours. Some guards were said to be diligent, others less so. That history opened the door to several theories. The first theory was that the dead man had been a trespasser, possibly a scavenger, intruder, or activist, who entered the abandoned wing for his own reasons and suffered a fatal fall. There was some logic to this. Disused industrial sites often attract the desperate and the curious alike. Scrap thieves cut fencing. Young men explore forbidden places for thrills. Political agitators target factories they believe to be corrupt or dangerous. The old dye wing, with its labyrinth of catwalks and vents, would certainly have appealed to anyone looking either to hide or to make a statement. According to this theory, the victim may have climbed to the top of Shaft 4, intending to sabotage the purge system, steal metal components, or simply investigate the interior. Then, he slipped. The injuries to his legs and shoulder were consistent with a fall. Once trapped inside, he may have tried to climb out using the internal braces, wrapping his hands with strips of his own clothing to protect against heat. But if the purge cycle activated while he was still inside, the shaft would have become a death chamber. It was a grim possibility, but it did not explain why nobody ever identified him. Even trespassers are usually missed by someone. The second theory was far darker. Some investigators wondered whether the man had been placed there deliberately. This idea did not necessarily mean he had been murdered somewhere else and hidden after death. The soot in his lungs argued strongly against that. but it remained possible that he had been chased, thrown, or forced into the shaft by another person. Someone familiar with the plant. Someone who knew both how hidden the location was and how destructive the heat would be. If that were true, the shaft was not merely where he died. It was the weapon. This theory gained a little support from whispers among former workers, though nothing solid ever emerged. A few claimed the abandoned wing was sometimes used for off-the-books dealings. Others spoke vaguely of night shipments, unofficial access, and people being paid not to ask questions. One retired guard later told a reporter that certain doors in the old wing had a habit of being found open on mornings when they were supposed to be locked. But rumors are not evidence. And in this case, evidence was painfully scarce. The third theory was suicide. At first glance, it seemed implausible. The method was so brutal, so complicated, and so uncertain that many dismissed it immediately. But others argued that the very complexity of it might have been the point. If a man wished not only to die, but to vanish, to leave behind almost nothing, to prevent easy identification, to spare his family shame, or to erase himself from the world entirely, then a hot industrial shaft inside a neglected section of a failing factory would offer a horrifying degree of finality. There were problems with this theory too. To carry it out, the victim would likely have needed prior knowledge of the building layout, the access route, and the workings of the purge system. Police checked current and former employee lists, along with contractors and maintenance staff, but no obvious match appeared among men known to have gone missing. Unless, of course, the man had worked there under another name, or had a connection no one ever discovered. Years later, another theory emerged from local storytelling rather than formal police work. A former mechanic claimed that in the months before the body was found, youths from outside the district sometimes sneaked into the old part of the mill at night to smoke, drink, and dare one another to climb the upper walkways. The higher catwalks, he said, offered a thrilling view across the factory roofs and neighboring roads. If that account was true, then the victim might have been part of a group. Perhaps he fell during some reckless challenge. Perhaps the others fled in panic, terrified that coming forward would expose them to arrest, blame, or worse. This would explain the lack of witnesses from inside the workforce, and might even explain the absence of a missing persons report, if the victim had been far from home and among companions unwilling to contact his family. But again, there was no proof, only fragments. Always fragments. One especially haunting detail never left Inspector Amina Yusuf: the cloth around the victim's hands. To her, it suggested presence of mind after the fall. Pain, yes, but also intention. The man had tried to save himself. He had torn his clothing. He had thought. He had acted. Somewhere in those final moments, trapped in heat and darkness, he must have believed escape was still possible. That idea transformed the case from a mere industrial mystery into something much more disturbing. Because it meant the unknown man was not just a body discovered in an impossible place. He was a person who had fought to live and still disappeared from the world as if he had never been there. As the years passed, the case cooled. The mill downsized further. Sections were shut. Records were lost or damaged. Workers retired, died, or moved away. Ownership changed hands. Files were boxed, misfiled, or forgotten. The abandoned die wing was eventually stripped of salvageable equipment and sealed. No arrest was ever made. No definitive suspect was named. No identity was confirmed. Sometime later, with no family to claim the remains, the unknown man was buried under a simple marker bearing only the date of discovery and a case number that meant nothing to anyone outside the file. And that, for many people, is the most unsettling part of all. Not simply that a man died in such a cruel and hidden place. Not simply that he may have spent his final minutes alone in darkness, injured and burning, trying desperately to climb toward a hatch he could not reach. But that after all the appeals, all the rumors, all the newspaper sketches, and all the years that followed, nobody came. No mother identifying a jacket. No brother recognizing the dental work. No old friend remembering the bus route. No one standing before investigators and saying, "I know who he was." Maybe someone, somewhere, always knew, and chose silence. Maybe the truth was buried in fear. Maybe it was buried in shame. Or maybe, in a country as vast and complicated as Nigeria, one lost man simply passed through the cracks so completely that by the time he was found, the trail behind him had already gone cold. Whatever the answer, the burned body inside Shaft 4 remains one of those rare cases that resists every neat explanation. A nameless man. A sealed industrial shaft. Signs of panic. Signs of suffering. Signs that he did not expect to die there. And above all, one unbearable question. If he was missed, why did no one ever come looking? Good night.